Hi, my name is Mark Stern. I'm one of the instructors for Social Work 601. Today I'd like to spend some time discussing poverty in the United States, some of the policy challenges in measuring it, patterns and trends in the United States, and some alternative ways of thinking about and measuring poverty and social well-being. On the one hand, we can think about poverty as this dry statistical concept. It's simply applying a definition to arrive at a number. But for the general public, poverty carries a lot of baggage associated with ideas like inferiority and deficiency. If poverty were just about statistics, it wouldn't be as difficult of a policy issue as it is. But ultimately, when we talk about poverty, we talk about who is deserving of help and who isn't, who is needy through no fault of their own, and who should suffer because of bad behavior. This focus on deficits has occurred in part because we don't think about inequality and poverty as two sides of the same coin. Since the 1970s, the poverty debate has often gotten linked to the discussion of so-called social pathologies, rather than the failure of the economy to deliver a decent standard of living. It's time to reverse this pattern and see poverty as the most acute form of economic inequality. As a purely statistical exercise, we need to make a number of decisions. Do we estimate poverty for individuals or for families? How do we define families, especially in an era like today when our definitions are changing so quickly? Over how long of a period do we estimate poverty? What resources do we use? And finally, to what standard do we compare these resources? Once we throw politics into the equation, however, it becomes more complicated, as this old TV show illustrates. You know, there's a lot that's correct about that episode, especially the fact that they end up not doing anything. But there's one thing that I really hate about this episode. They basically make fun of Molly Orshansky and make it sound like she was just some Polish peasant. In fact, she was a pioneer among women in the economics profession at a time when it was primarily a men's club. Her work was path-breaking in 1963. It's not her fault that we haven't done better in the last 50 years. So, like on TV, we've seen a lot of inaction with the official poverty line. Some of it is unavoidable. For example, the time span used always faces a Goldilocks problem. It's either too long, so we miss short-term economic emergencies, or too short, so students end up being defined as poor. Many programs that make a huge difference for poor families, like the Earned Income Tax Credit and food stamps, didn't even exist in 1963. Politics, too, have prevented us from moving ahead in updating the Orshansky thresholds. That said, the current poverty line is a mess. It goes back to a 1955 food budget study by the Ag Department, which was already inadequate in the early 60s when Orshansky did her work. Orshansky struggled as well because there was no reliable data at that time on pre-tax income. We haven't changed it for two reasons. First, bureaucracies don't like to change. In fact, we almost revised the index in the 1960s, but the White House Budget Office thought it was too big of a headache. Since then, political polarization is primarily to blame. Liberals want an index that's more sensitive to economic hardship. Conservatives want one that simply shows less poverty. In fact, in the 1980s, the Reagan administration wanted to include healthcare costs as income, which would have meant that the sicker you got, the less likely you were to be poor. So what does the official poverty rate tell us, with all of its inadequacy? Poverty dropped quickly during the late 1960s and early 1970s and then stalled. It's gone up and down a little bit with the business cycle since then. For me, the story is that the economic growth we've experienced since the 1970s hasn't really paid off in terms of declines in poverty. There are two questions we can ask about poverty. First, the composition question is what proportion of poor people belong to a particular group? The second question, the risk question, is what social groups are most likely to be poor. The short answer to the composition question is that most poor people are white, born in the United States, did not work in the previous year, and were between the ages of 18 and 64. In terms of the risk of poverty, however, the answer is people living alone, African Americans and Hispanics, children, non-citizens, and particularly female-headed families with children. Certainly one of the headlines from the official poverty data is that children face a higher risk of poverty and older Americans have faced a lower risk of poverty since the 1970s. However, as I'll note later, the official rate may be somewhat misleading in this respect. One feature of poverty that has an important impact on policy and practice is its spatial concentration. Certainly in Philadelphia, some Black and Latino neighborhoods suffer from extremely high poverty rates. This concentration of poverty can create its own problems by increasing the segregation of poor people, especially if those who are African American and Latino. What alternatives do we have to the current poverty definition? The simplest alternative is a relative measure of poverty that focuses on the proportion of the population living on less than 60% of median household income. This is the measure used by the European Union. There are problems, though. In Europe, for example, it turns out that the Czech Republic has the lowest poverty rate, not because Czechs are doing so well, but because the average Czech isn't doing so well. If your median income is low, your poverty rate is also going to be low. This also means that during a recession, as median incomes drop, your poverty rate may also go down, which is somewhat counterintuitive. A second alternative is to improve the official measure. We can do this by expanding the definition of income, for example, by including food stamps and housing subsidies, and by expanding the expenditures we consider, taxes, medical expenses. We can also adjust it for geographic variation to recognize that housing costs are higher in New York or San Francisco than in Dallas or St. Louis. In fact, the Obama administration has begun experimenting with this approach, what they call a supplemental poverty measure, or SPM. Its key innovation is to link poverty thresholds to households' actual expenditures using the government Consumer Expenditures Survey. The big switch here is that it puts less emphasis on food and more emphasis on housing, because that is a much larger proportion of people's expenditures today than it was half a century ago. Using the SPM really changes our view of poverty risks. If we make these adjustments, older Americans are more likely and children less likely to be poor. African Americans' poverty rate drops a bit from 27 to 26%, while Latinos' poverty increases from 26 to 28%. Perhaps most interestingly, the supplemental poverty rate changes the narrative about trends in poverty. Rather than stagnating, as the official rate suggests, the SPM shows a steady improvement in the status of low-income Americans, in large part due to the impact of the Earned Income Tax Credit in increasing the after-tax income of families with children. By including data on average rents, the SPM gives more realistic poverty estimates for cities with high housing costs. As we can see here, the poverty rate of LA, San Francisco, and San Jose are much higher using the new data. Philadelphia, in case you haven't noticed, doesn't have particularly high rents, so the SPM is only slightly higher here than the official rate. The third alternative to the official poverty line is to develop a multi-dimensional measure of well-being that examines income and other factors that contribute to a decent life. For example, an international commission proposed these 8 dimensions of well-being, ranging from material standard of living, that is poverty, to political voice, a decent environment, health, and social connection. Eurostat, the European Union statistical agency, has compiled data on a variety of measures. They argue that such factors as how people spend their leisure time, whether young adults live with their parents out of economic necessity, or people suffer from gender discrimination at work should be part of the poverty and social exclusion discussion. It is in the social work profession's interest to promote a broader definition of social well-being. During most of the 20th century, social workers were seen as experts on poverty, and their advice was sought and listened to. But during the 1960s, as poverty became defined in narrow economic terms, economists displaced social workers as the poverty experts. Using a multidimensional measure of poverty could help social workers get their way back into the poverty policy debate. For example, my research team here at Penn has estimated a multidimensional measure of well-being. We found that some dimensions, like this one, which we call social stress, are related to both economic resources and the level of social connection in the neighborhood. So I ask you, who knows more about strengthening community connections, social workers or economists? It's time for social workers to see themselves as policy practitioners and to regain a seat at the table when poverty is the topic. That's it for now. Thanks for listening.